Okay, so now this video is called the Homefront. So we're going to talk about what World War II was like on the American homeland. Not necessarily fighting the war, what we were doing at home, but what life was like here in the United States. So once FDR spoke to the nation about Pearl Harbor, the people of the United States really rallied around him. He called it a day that will live in infamy, and the feelings that it caused, the anger, the sadness, all that stuff we were able to kind of bottle up and use to promote the war and really get involved and go finish World War II. So the war meant the U.S. had to produce a lot of military equipment and supplies for themselves and all these other allied powers. So we joined Britain and France, and they needed stuff just like we needed stuff. So we were producing a lot of stuff. So more supplies means more production means more jobs, more money, better economy. You see the change. So the World War II really got us out of the Great Depression because we had to produce a lot more things for the war. People had to fill those jobs as soldiers were over, and our economy was really rebounding. Also, propaganda was heavily used, or advertising, to promote the war. People sold war bonds to raise money for the war. And this kind of helped Americans, both the war bonds and propaganda, to see the importance of the war, made sure that Americans stayed focused on it and didn't lose the fact that we're fighting this war in Europe and fighting this war in the Pacific in Japan. So those things were instrumental at the home front. So how did we pay for the war? Well, obviously, I talked about a second ago, propaganda was used to encourage people to support the war in any way possible, whether joining the war, working and building things for the war, buying war bonds, you know. People also had to ration goods like gasoline and sugar and shoes and all these items that they were rationed. You could only get so many of them at a certain amount of time because they had to be sent over for the war effort. All right, soldiers had to have shoes. They had to have food to eat, stuff like that. So we could only use a certain amount of things here to make sure our soldiers had enough over there. The income tax was raised. All right, so the income tax is raised to bring in more money for the war, and war bonds were sold, which were loans the government promised to pay back with interest. So if I wanted to support the war, but for some reason I couldn't fight, I could buy a $100 war bond. That $100 went to the government for the war, and the government would pay me interest, maybe give me $115 back. So you see how that works there. So movie stars and war heroes, people that were injured or did a heroic thing in the war, traveled around the country selling war bonds, and posters were created to encourage people to support the war. So all these endorsements, plays, commercials, all these types of things were different types of propaganda. So you had Dr. Seuss making propaganda posters. You know, had the Uncle Sam posters. You had the woman going like this, you know, Rosie the Riveter, you know, showing how strong she is. So all those are ways that we supported and paid for the war. So then you have opportunities for minorities and women. The war opened up new job opportunities for African Americans. You had over 1 million people in defense jobs in African Americans. Native Americans and Hispanic Americans also worked in a lot of war effort jobs. Many Americans joined, or many minorities who were Americans joined the war by fighting in it. And they joined the war effort by fighting in it. And they had to serve in segregated units due to racism. One of the very famous segregated units, they made a movie out of it recently. It was called the Tuskegee Airmen, who were these African American pilots. And they were very you know, great fighters. You know, they had tons of awards, and they were just great soldiers. But unfortunately, even joining the war, even though they were willing to fight for the country they lived in, that a lot of people there didn't like them, they were forced to serve in segregated units. So it was a very weird message we were sending people this way. Many women replaced men in the work front because those men were over there working as soldiers. So obviously you had a lot of women gaining jobs. The country promoted Rosie the Riveter, which is a woman. I think she's in blue and a red bandana. She's kind of flexing. You know, it's a very powerful image showing strong working women working for the war effort. And many women served in the military as well because you had these women that, you know, would go over to be desk clerks or nurses or whatever they needed to in the war. And they were helping in ways that they could. Obviously they weren't allowed to fight. And then, unfortunately, a dark cloud for us during World War II in America was Japanese-American internment. So after Pearl Harbor, a lot of Americans were obviously angry, they were sad, and unfortunately they took a lot of that anger out and directed it towards Japanese Americans, or Japanese that had moved here to America, that clearly had nothing to do with Pearl Harbor. So FDR signed this executive order that called for the removal of Japanese and Japanese Americans from the Pacific coast, and this became known as Japanese-American Internment. Thousands of Japanese Americans and Japanese people who had moved here were forced to sell their possessions, homes, and cars, whatever they had, and move to these prison-like camps. And many of these prisoners were born in the United States. They just happened to be of Japanese ancestry. All right? But obviously, that resentment that Americans had, that fear that they had, this is how we resorted to handling that issue, and it was a terrible thing that we did, but it is something important that you need to know. One of the Japanese American men, Fred Korematsu, he appealed to the Supreme Court and basically said there's no way this is constitutional, which in reality, looking back on it, it probably isn't now, or probably definitely is not now. It's definitely not morally a right thing to do. But the Supreme Court said that the order was constitutional based on military necessity. So the military had to operate this way to make sure the country stayed safe. Obviously, that's an easy way out of this. Fear was the thing that drove the Japanese internment more than anything else, and that's a dark cloud on the home front. But propaganda, war bonds, the rise in jobs, the rise out of the economy, Japanese-American internment, the opportunities for minorities in World War II, all are what happens in the home front of the United States during World War II.